That is easily the best introduction that I have ever received. For years, people will be trying to meet that standard that you've set. So thank you so much. Yeah, the snow, we love the snow. We're glad to be out of the Texas heat, but please do be praying for the people in Texas right now because they're experiencing great difficulty because they're not used to snow, but they've got it right now. Let me get started. Thank you so much to the Mosaic leadership for inviting me to speak. I've been back at TEDS as a professor, as Caroline said, for only a few short years. And in that time, it has become something of a dream of mine to speak to Mosaic. But in my head, it looked really different. It'd be years from now, and I'd be an established advocate for my students. And while we're at it, we'd be in person, and I'd probably be thanking God that I hadn't spilled soup on myself when I got to speak, if that somehow were the case. And the thing is that I'm not sure that I will ever feel that I've earned the opportunity to speak with you. But what I've learned in the year that I've been coming to Mosaic is one, that you are open to dialogue and respecting where each of your speakers is at. But I've also learned that my role really is to stand alongside you and to be faithful in each of the small actions that God asks me to take. But today I've been asked to share about building bridges in love in the classroom. And here again, I signal that I feel out of my depth. I've only been a full-time professor for a few short years. I am literally the youngest faculty member, and I'm white and Western. So today I really cannot offer you an ideal picture of what a professor will do. Because again, I can't. But to an extent, it also wouldn't offer you anything new. Even a few short weeks ago, we heard student leaders share ideas for how professors might serve you better. I heartily agree with all of those suggestions, and I assure you that I took notes. Another reason that I won't share with you a kind of ideal for professors is that most of you won't be professors. Instead, I've decided to share why I make certain decisions when I'm in my classroom, when I guide discussions. And sometimes these things will apply to you when you're in your classrooms, but they may also apply to you as you go out into the world, as you have difficult conversations, or as you lead others. And so with that, with the hope that God will guide me to speak truth and to learn from each of you as we speak together, the teacher and learner in me recognizes the teacher and learner in you. In the rest of our time today, I will share 3 conscious choices for why I do what I do in the classroom. With each, I'll try to offer some examples as well as some times that things went horribly wrong. So a first principle or choice is that, and sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my keynote, so we'll see if I can work this out. There we go. Whenever possible, I try to avoid language that might marginalize someone, especially if it's something that it matters a lot to them and matters almost nothing to me. Of course, this might seem like an easy one. You might be thinking, well, yeah, not saying rude things is a pretty low bar, and it really is. But I decided to pick up on some examples that are slightly more subtle. And I also decided to consciously choose examples that are drawn from religious marginalization or the marginalization of those from other religious perspectives very intentionally, because I thought it might offer a complement to our usual discussions here. So, for example, I choose not to use BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, year of the Lord when I note years. Instead, I say BCE, before Common Era, or Common Era. A student asked me about this recently, not least because the authors of the textbook that I've chosen actually said why they thought it was a good idea to make the opposite decision. And I explained that this doesn't matter to me. My faith is not diminished in any way when I say Common Era. And as I explained, Common Era before Common Era, these are still based on the traditional year that Jesus was born, which of course isn't actually the year that Jesus was probably born anyway. So it still has a marginalizing effect for non-Christians, and it also still acknowledges the importance of Jesus for human history. When I use CE and BCE, I gesture towards those sisters and brothers that do not profess faith in Christ and try to communicate that I care about their potential marginalization and that I'll do what I know to do to respect them. I also don't say the name of the Lord. When I'm referring to the Tetragrammaton, YHWH, I say Adonai. This is for two reasons. The first is I actually think it's a valuable way for me to continue to hold the Lord in a position of reverence. God is not like us, and his name should be treated as holy. The second reason, which is more important, is I choose not to say that out of respect for my Jewish sisters and brothers who hear something coarse and disrespectful when we say it. Now, I have every right to say the name of the Lord. In fact, the New Testament teaches us that we can draw near to the throne of grace with confidence and call upon the Lord. But again, my faith is not diminished when I choose to say Adonai instead of the Lord's proper name. In many ways, my faith has actually been strengthened as I'm conscious of the holiness of God when I see his name. And as we see in Paul's letters to the Romans and the Corinthians and elsewhere, freedom in Christ is freedom to make choices that respect and love those around us. Now, I offer these as representative examples. They are conscious decisions that I have personally made, but they're by no means decisions that you must make. Further, I have a lot more to learn. In fact, this was highlighted to me very recently in a way that I did not anticipate at all. A new friend read something that I wrote online. He took offense to what I said because I noted that the Nicene Creed provides global unity for all who profess faith in Christ. This friend calls himself a non-Trinitarian Christian. And he explained to me that I had marginalized him and then many others like him because they do not profess faith in Christ. They do profess faith in Christ, though not a Christ who is pre-existent person before the incarnation. And y'all hang with me here. So to an extent, my new friend was right. But here I felt this principle for my life, that is that I avoid language that is unduly offensive, that it was sincerely pressed. I truly believe that the Trinity is absolutely an essential component of the Christian faith. And while I think that what unites us should be more important than what divides us, this struck me as a reasonable boundary to draw around Christians. So when I replied, I sincerely apologized. Even if what I had done was not wrong per se, I had hurt my friend and I had caused him to feel marginalized and excluded from the community of faith. I explained to him that the doctrine of the Trinity was very important to me, and I had mixed feelings about downplaying it. But I asked him what I could have said that represented my view accurately, but still respected him and those like him. He gave me a really reasonable option. My view has not changed at all, but now I know a small change that I could make to my language to not only say something firm and orthodox, but also to say something inclusive and respectful and loving to my friend and, again, the community like him. So in that, I respected my brother and he respected me. And our relationship continues for another day when we might have another important conversation. I know all too well that I still use language that does not honor everyone around me. Most of it is ignorant or at least unintentional, but some of it is just conditioned and working it out is hard. In the last year or so, I've been working to eliminate language that reinforces stigmas around mental illness, like that's crazy or I'm OCD or something like that, as well as language that arises out of innuendo and may even reflect some latent homophobia, like that sucks. And I'm sorry for using the crass phrase today. When I say these things and notice what I've done, I apologize and acknowledge that I wish I had made a different decision. The act of apologizing is a small gesture of love towards those who might be hurt by my language. But I'm embarrassed to say at how ingrained some of these things are in my speech patterns and how many more missteps I will make before that is no longer the case. At this point, some among you might say that I yield to the God of political correctness, but I do not. Being intentional with my language is a way to love the people around me. And as I hope I've illustrated, we do not have to let go of the things that are important to us to show our neighbors that we care. a second principle. I try to use my authority primarily to facilitate conversations and to care for those who need someone to speak for them. By the grace of God, a class offers me the opportunity to build a relationship with my students. Even in cases where students and I interact less, we have less of a personal relationship, I see them about 15 times. And I have the opportunity to read their work, to hear more of where they're coming from. We have space to get to know one another before I press them or ask them to consider another viewpoint. My canon course on Paul and general epistles is perhaps the best illustration of this. On the first day, we talk about history, social settings, Jewish literature. Sometimes a student will ask me a question like, what was the first century like for women? I answer in as neutral a way as I can. I say something like, women were marginalized, but not all women were marginalized to the same degree. But we'll talk more about that later. This is an issue that I know is of great importance to many of my students, no matter what their current position is. But this is also an issue where students who disagree with me might think that I have a strong bias, because if the first day I meet them, I share a strong opinion about a contentious issue, then I might lose them forever. I have work to do to show that I take the biblical text seriously and that I respect people who disagree with me. I also have work to do in demonstrating that my class is not an authoritarian space. I welcome students to disagree with me, and I try to say this as early in our relationship as possible. Usually this is when I go over the syllabus and kind of set expectations for what our time together will entail. This is important to me because I'm conscious that even as a young woman, in my classroom, I have power. I never have to allow my students the opportunity to speak in dialogue. I have the capacity to dismantle arguments and even to shame those who are earlier in their intellectual journey. I can present only one side, my side, of any given argument. But most students would stop listening, and they definitely would stop taking my classes. I decide to yield my power and to invite critique so I can say something important and bold down the line. But I'll return to this in my third point. So first, I want to acknowledge how some of these decisions have created some considerable difficulty in the past. As you might guess, giving up power sometimes, often, has had negative implications for me. In fact, in my first year of teaching at another institution, I often had students openly disrespect me in my class. One of the more egregious and clear-cut examples was a young man who made a joke about whether women could teach Bible right at the time I opened the floor for questions at the beginning of my introduction to the New Testament class. Later in the semester, my department chair observed my class and he told me, "You give too much space. You're too open for dialogue. You're too deferential." At that point, I actually felt sick to my stomach. I had had such great pain in all these experiences. And what he was telling me is that I could have prevented it, that it was my fault. So I remember reflecting on how I could have been stronger and firmer and ultimately more like my male colleagues. The next semester, I tried this new approach. I was tougher. I used some of the language that I had learned from my male colleagues to manage my classroom, and I guess I felt a little more respected, but I was miserable. I hated teaching those classes. I felt like a shell of myself, and then I read my teaching evaluations. The students got about as close to calling me something that you call women as they could have without actually saying it. They insulted my knowledge, my character, my appearance. And by the way, I was pregnant, so this is particularly terrible. They insulted everything. In trying to be more effective and more respected, I had just become different. And I wasn't myself. And so with that, I had tried being me and I had tried being tough, and it didn't work. And so at that point, I wondered if I, Madison, would ever, especially as a young woman, be able to be a good professor, someone who was respected and loved, not admired, but heard. I wanted to be a professor who could do the things I wanted to do in the classroom, to build bridges and to have good conversations, to bring together students with diverse perspectives for a good conversation. Ultimately, I decided that to honor God with my teaching, I had to honor how he made me. And I had to honor the people on the other side of the bridge a little more too, my students. I still get disrespected and it still makes me angrier than I'd like. But when my students leave my class, I think they know me. And I hope they know I love them. Before moving to a third point, I have one more failure to share, and somewhat more abstractly. I hope that my personal relationships with my students will open doors for me. I want to be able to speak difficult truths with them and to challenge their biases. Somewhat recently, I connected with a student. He would walk with me after class, ask me about my academic and faith journeys, as well as my family. But in the course of our time together, I saw several signs that he had some unconscious bias against female professors. So one day when a door was opened, I acknowledged his behavior. It didn't go well. He actually ended up yelling at me in my office. Some people might not trust that we've used careful craftsmanship in constructing our bridges. One of the reasons that I actually do regret speaking with that student is that I did it for me. I really didn't want him to know that he disrespected me. And I could pretend that I did this on behalf of all women everywhere, but I didn't. After that situation, I thought more about what had gone wrong and what I would do differently the next time. I decided that I needed a new principle, one that would govern when I take that sort of risk with the student that might sever an existing positive relationship. I decided that from now on, I will only call out a student more directly when it's on behalf of another student, or at least a group more marginalized than a white female professor. But this raises another issue that arises in the classroom. Every one of my students is worthy of love and respect, even when they're really, really wrong. And finding ways of addressing those errant viewpoints without shaming the students involved is incredibly difficult, especially from my position of power. And I continue to learn how to do this well. So a final related choice that I make is that I pick my battles so I can fight the ones that are most important. Hoping that I have been careful with my language in ways that I've shared and in ways that I have not, and acknowledging that I have power in my classroom that I have to use responsibly to draw upon my relationships with students in a positive way. I reveal that I am very intentional about when I speak firmly about something and at what point I address certain issues. I've already highlighted, for example, that I delay a conversation about the role of women in early Christianity. But what I have not shared is how I prepare students for the conversation along the way. As we interpret various Pauline letters, I highlight what women were likely doing from the perspective of most. So what is consensus in the early church? I mentioned Phoebe and Chloe and Prisca and even Euodia and Syntyche. They're rabble rousers. These are women who are valuable and worthy of mention. I do this so that even if my students still conclude reasonably that Paul does not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man, my students have a portrait for their sisters ministering. I give each woman in the room a mirror to see themselves in the letters of Paul. And I give space because space is required. Sorry, I'm seeing some of my female students and it makes it harder. So I'm gonna stop looking at y'all. I also delay the conversation about slavery until we reach the letter to Philemon. But I highlight Paul's exhortations along the way to slaves and to masters. The household codes provide a framework for Paul's heart for his brothers and sisters who have been enslaved. Along the way, I present a basic view about what is generally accepted about the text first. I allow students to raise objections and to press my reading, as I have all along the way. I do this because I want to ensure that we have a shared understanding about what Christian teaching is about slavery in the New Testament. I also give students space to disagree about Paul's intention when he penned Philemon, although I do quickly make clear that I think he was pretty clear with his recipient. On that day, I remind students that I have welcomed dialogue on every point to date in my class. But I tell them that there is at least one point on which I will never budge. That's slavery at any point and in any form is evil. And arguments that claim that first century slavery weren't so bad are not historically founded and allow for a poor reading of the biblical text, one that insults the families of people who have been enslaved everywhere, especially by chattel slavery. In the moment that I share this, I can be as tough as any professor that I have ever seen, male or female, because I have shown, I'm sorry, I have shown that I reserve this for matters of the utmost importance. For me, picking battles cannot be an excuse to stay silent. It has to be a decision to wait to get loud. So it may, in conclusion, seem self-aggrandizing for me to have reflected on what I do. This is one of the reasons that I have peppered my failures in along the way. But the primary reason that I've made this decision is that I will not tell any of you to be more considerate, more accommodating, and to not speak up for yourselves. What I ask you to do is to listen to God and to do what you can to be faithful in each small action that God compels you to take. But in case my reflections have been too abstract, let me reframe them slightly. My hope is that when God gives you the strength, you will be intentional and inclusive in your language, generous with any power that you might receive, and loud, especially in my classroom. Thank you.